Hey everybody, hope we're ready to talk about some civil rights and civil liberties. So this week we are going to have significantly more content than we did last week. View last week as that little break that you get in the middle of the semester as we got to cover just some of the overarching concepts regarding electoral systems. And now we're going to dive into the details and the weeds once again, and we're going to explore the history of civil rights and civil liberties in the United States. So, in this lecture, I'm structuring it kind of as a progression throughout history. We're going to start with early American history. We're going to look at the abolitionist movement, how it developed into the Reconstruction era after the Civil War in the United States right around the 1860s. We're going to also expand that through a brief examination of the black codes that restricted minority access to the polls and general minority rights within the southeastern states within the United States as they developed into Jim Crow legislation in the civil rights era. And then we will end the lecture focusing on a contemporary discussion about really some aspects of our contemporary threats of civil liberties and civil rights. And let me rephrase that, not as much threats as contemporary restrictions or periods of expansion of civil rights and civil liberties through the contemporary fight for equal marriage rights that was provided in the 2015 ruling of Obergefell versus Hodges, in addition to the contemporary discussions around the prison industrial complex within the United States. So let's begin one of the more detailed and exciting lectures from my personal point of view. So there is a key distinction we have to make here between two key terms, civil rights, civil liberties, and additionally, I want us to understand what civil disobedience is, especially at a time in U.S. history where public protests are very front and focal in our national discourse. So let's start with the key term, civil rights. What are civil rights? We take this term for granted as we feel like we understand it so simply. It's our rights to be civil. No, that's not it. Civil rights are actually protections from individuals and groups discriminating minority collectives. So think of it as protections for individuals and groups from discrimination by the government or other individuals. Actually, let's rephrase this. There are protections for individuals and groups from discrimination by other individuals, predominantly majority groups. This is where we see guarantees of equal citizenship, and in order to maintain civil rights, we see protections from discrimination by majorities. So a civil right is a protection from majorities that have a tendency to discriminate. Now, how does that differ from civil liberties? Well, civil liberties, think of it, instead of majority groups and general discrimination from majority and minority sentiments, we're looking at protections of restrictions from the government. So a civil liberty is a constitutional protection against your government. You are safe from infringement from not just majority groups, but the government in charge at any given moment. So when we think of civil liberties, think about the Bill of Rights. Think about those 10 guiding amendments that tell us these are our individual rights. We'll talk about a process called selective incorporation later on, which helps us understand the development of our civil liberties, particularly in the Bill of Rights throughout U.S. history. But we also want to, our main takeaway is that we have to maintain this distinction between civil liberties and civil rights, as civil rights are protections from discrimination by majorities. So when you visualize this concept, think of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. We weren't necessarily arguing that our government wasn't restricting individuals and as much as we were arguing that there were collectives, there were majorities, overwhelming majorities influencing the discourse among civil society. So it was civil rights fights that made it to where majority groups in certain states were not able to oppress minority groups. Now, when we talk about that civil rights movement of the 1960s, a key term is perfectly exemplified. That is civil disobedience. This is peaceful protest in which individuals reveal unjust laws by disobeying them simply, but doing so peaceably. We think of the greatest example of this stemming from Plessy v. Ferguson's case, which brought forward not the most positive conclusions by our Supreme Court, although they were later overturned in Brown v. Board of Education. We do see civil disobedience was a primary tool in getting that case heard by the Supreme Court, as Homer Plessy engaged in civil disobedience, knowingly riding a white cart during the Railway Car Act, after the implementation of the Separate Railway Car Act. He rode the white cart railway cart, hard to say, and notified the authorities, doing so purposefully and peacefully, acting in civil disobedience. This is oftentimes driven by economic inequalities, a lack of opportunity, and a lack of true positive outcomes in a free society. And this is one of the primary tools beyond our ability to vote to maintain accountability within government. And when you look at the civil rights period of the 1960s, we see without civil disobedience, we would not have the capacity of holding authorities accountable for many individuals within the United States, which is the ability to vote. When we look at our history and the struggle for equality, we see numerous periods of analysis that we need to gravitate towards. First, we see that equality was not a foundational aspect of some of our Constitution, which warranted our founding fathers during the Reconstruction era to emphasize the need for constitutional protections of equality for all in our 14th Amendment in 1868, following the Civil War. Later on, we do see about 50, 60 years later, the expansion of voting rights for women. Women's suffrage has been fully met in 1920, as that was finally obtained in the United States. But following this came a period of Jim Crow era legislation that predominantly restricted minority demographic groups from being able to reach the polls and express their vote and use their primary tool of accountability, which is electoral accountability, voting out individuals who harm you legislatively. We also see the expansion of this fight for equality in contemporary days as we see fighting against the prison industrial complex by certain collectives, which has improved since 2008, which we will explore later on, in addition to the expansion of same-sex marriage protections by our federal government, which were only implemented after a 2015 Supreme Court ruling provided by Obergefell v. Hodges. Why do I mention same-sex marriage, race, and all of these issues in regards to the fight for equality in a discussion about civil rights and civil liberties? Well, we are seeing the expansion of civil rights and civil liberties, the protection of our civil liberties through these case studies throughout U.S. history. And we see through these case studies that this fight for equality within our statutory law and within applied practices among our civil society is ongoing and brings with it new threats with each contemporary development. So let's talk briefly. What are civil liberties? We talked about this a second ago, as they are protections from governments from restricting your civil liberties. So the Bill of Rights protects our liberties. This is a list of individual liberties within the United States. But we have to understand a key term, selective incorporation. This states that originally, when we first ratified our Bill of Rights, it did not protect individuals from government. Instead, it protected state governments from federal authorities. Because what was the sentiment that our founding fathers had, particularly the anti-federalists? That it's not the government that we need to be fearful of, it is the central government that we need to be fearful of in this federal system, in which we have fears that state rights will be trampled. And that was what incentivized the implementation of the Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights early on, predominantly through historical texts, in addition to a Supreme Court ruling provided in Barron v. Baltimore, we see it only applied to restricting the federal government and protecting state governments and state rights. When they looked at the actions of individuals, they were predominantly referring to the actions of states and the individuals who make up state leadership. So we see Barron v. Baltimore was a Supreme Court ruling that determined the Bill of Rights not only they determined that the Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government and was not a legal code that restricted state governments. So due to the 1833 ruling in Barron v. Baltimore, there was an identified need for something called selective incorporation. This is where, on a case-by-case basis, the Supreme Court, in rulings that contradict and overturn the ruling provided in Barron v. Baltimore, determined that each of our Bill of Rights actually applies not just to our federal government, but also to our state governments. Our Bill of Rights does not just protect state rights to be autonomous, but individual rights to be autonomous through a process called selective incorporation. And without selective incorporation, we would see our Bill of Rights only applying to as protections for state governments to maintain these listed rights. So selective incorporation, to repeat, is a case-by-case ruling by the Supreme Court, a series of case-by-case rulings provided by the Supreme Court, which made our Bill of Rights apply to restrict state governments as well as federal governments, because civil liberties are restrictions of the government to provide protections for individuals. And in early American history, under the case of Barron v. Baltimore, for states' rights as well. This all relies on the 14th Amendment. The selective incorporation process would not have occurred if it weren't for the 14th Amendment, in which we determine that no state shall enforce a law that challenges the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Right here, it declares that although our Bill of Rights restricted the federal government and protection of our states, no state, in addition, shall enforce a law that challenges the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, which we can infer are presented in our list of civil liberties within the Bill of Rights. Protections for you from your government. That is how we would define a civil liberty. So, this is where we address that concept. This is a slide predominantly tailored for the in-person class, but I still want to ask you as you're listening, maybe pause and ponder upon yourself. What a classy way of talking. Let's talk about the contradiction between security and individual liberties. A state has an obligation to its citizens, both to provide it security of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but in addition, provide it with that liberty, those individual liberties, your ability to not be restricted by your federal government. But we acknowledge a point of conflict here. You cannot provide absolute security without restricting the liberty of some citizens. Remember that state of nature concept. If you want to become a part of a state, you have to forfeit some rights. You have to forfeit the right to steal and pillage your neighbor's properties in order to have your property protected. So when we have a state, we are all on some level forfeiting some liberties for the protection of our securities by the state. Now we have to find a perfect median between when our state can and cannot act, when they are, for one, either protecting the security of the state or ensuring the individual liberties of the citizens of the state. So when we have certain circumstances, I want you to ask yourself, how impactful does a threat have to be for the state to intervene rationally? And under circumstances, how does the responsibility of the state differ when a state security threat is something like, say, a foreign military compared to a pandemic, as we've had in recent years? And what are some examples of the U.S. government restricting individual liberties in order to address a national security threat? Are these actions just? Think about early history, referring to moments like Japanese internment camps during World War II, to contemporary reactions like expanding mass surveillance in response to 9/11 security threats. So when is it just for a state to act in prioritization of securities or individual liberties? And where is the line? And I would promise you that this line resides on a different point of the spectrum for each and every individual. And that's where we can identify rational and nuanced debate about how our government should act in response to national security threats, prioritizing security or individual liberty. So let's talk about social movements in the US and really revisit that term civil disobedience. This is where, of course, we remember peaceful protests in order to identify and reveal detrimental legislation restricting individuals or collectives. So in the United States, we see social movements predominating in recent and historical periods. So when we talk about social movements, I reflected on a upper division political science course I took, in which we examined for an entire semester the role and influence of social movements. And there are a couple key terms I wanted to address in a brief slide before we move on. So first off, we have to understand the term participatory democracy. This is understood as a direct democracy in which you maintain frequent referendums and mass votes on specific government actions. In the United States, we do not have true participatory democracy, and instead we have representative democracy, which requires a degree of participation by individuals to access and maintain accountability of our representatives. We see when in participatory democracies, leaders of groups are oftentimes not held accountable as easily as elected representatives. So we participate in a representative democracy to ensure accountability of representatives. As we see, we do not have a direct democracy within the United States. Now, when we look at the means of accountability through either elections or through civil disobedience, we do tend to identify a problem within social movements at large. There are two dominating problems. First, one that's not portrayed on the slide, which is that every social movement that will ever exist, if you are acknowledging rational human nature, there will be the inevitable counter movement that persists. So you will never have a social movement lacking a counter movement because we're all cynics in our heart. We all have a tendency to disagree. If we don't, somebody in the statistics of the world will find a tendency to disagree. And an additional problem within social movements is what's referred to as the free rider problem. At various points in U.S. history, we've seen this focused on by various collectives, but it generally states that when you have a social movement of a collective advocating for progress for their specific demographic or collective, you see that there are also those who align with that group but do not pay into the general pool of funds or the common resources that are utilized by that collective. So, what do I mean by this? A free rider problem is when those who benefit from a resource, public goods, common pool resource, do not pay into them or underpay. Think of it as it's 2015 and there are mass protests of civil disobedience advocating for a particular ruling in Obergefell versus Hodges, in which we could possibly see the protection of same-sex marriage throughout the United States. Now, say you are an individual who would benefit from being able to have this protected access to this certain marriage, but you did not protest or involve yourself in any of the political discourse encouraging this Supreme Court ruling. Well, you represent the free rider problem. And there are two realities with this. For one, the free rider problem will always persist in every single social movement there ever is and will be. In addition, the free rider problem, when brought to certain extreme extents, can hinder a collective's ability to obtain civil liberty protections. So we see the free rider problem being evident in numerous social movements in the United States and nearly every single one. Additionally, we want to understand a concept called framing. This is mobilizing some feelings or suppressing others. In other words, the context in which you present a issue, a polling question, a headline that influences and oftentimes emphasize this, mobilizes preconceived prejudices or conceptions about society. So framing is an important tool of social movements and various informative agencies as they have the ability to mobilize preconceived prejudices and conceptions. What do I mean by that? They have the ability to frame issues in inflammatory or disinflammatory ways. I think the best and clearest example is the way we frame the policy positions regarding around the Supreme Court ruling in Roe v. Wade and Dobbs v. Jackson as either pro-choice or pro-life. Well, the framing for either of those labels is one that mobilizes conceptions and prejudices of what one may perceive to be the ability to determine life or the ability to determine choice, which often discourages compromise and mediation between the two agencies. So when we talk about social movements, what we see at the heart of it is a calling against the status quo. We see people utilizing their ability and protected free speech in the United States. Now, when we look at the history of free speech in the United States, it's worth going through the progression because this has not always been a clear-cut interpretation of our First Amendment. So, rewinding a bit through U.S. history, let's look at Schneck versus the U.S. in 1919, in which we determined in response to World War I pamphlet draft resistors, we determined that speech can be restricted if it poses a clear and present danger. And this was the case when people were handing out draft resisting pamphlets, encouraging individuals to not align with the draft if their draft number was called during World War I, revealing a foundational dissatisfaction with the way in which we mobilized and gathered a collective for conflicts. Sorry, my phone was ringing there for a second. I had to silence it in the pocket while still trying to remember how to talk about content. So continuing on without re-recording this slide, I want to address the Smith Act of 1940. This is a further extension of the Schneck versus U.S. Interpretation of the law in which we forbid advocating for the overthrow of the government. This is where you see the application of any sentiment saying we must overthrow the government, and if it did result in any form of insurrection or act of that nature, you would see them being held accountable, the individual who called for some sense of overthrowing of the government. Now, this, of course, is during World War II and is in response to those resisting the conflict and our engagement with that conflict abroad. Now, fast forwarding a bit, sorry about my order, let's talk about New York Times versus Sullivan. This is where we see the role of the media and media being a focus. In its 1964 ruling, we see comments about public figures are not only libelous if the person writing and publishing them knew what they were saying was false and they published it with malicious intent. What does that mean? What do I mean by libelous? What is libel and slander? So, for one, libel is written defamation harming one's character. It is when an individual publishing, and say the New York Times, knowingly reports false information with a malicious intent. Now, how does slander differ? Well, it's similarly represented, except verbally. This is spoken defamation harming one's character with clear malicious intent. Now, in this case, we saw that one threshold you have to meet to hold someone accountable for dangerous libel or slander speech is that you need to clearly illustrate malicious intent, which has been a challenge for providing clear evidence of in the court proceedings since this ruling. We see the expansion of this interpretation in, not the expansion of this, we see further interpretations in Brandenburg versus Ohio, the 1969 ruling, in which we determined that the government cannot punish inflammatory speech as long as it does not directly incite a specific person to enact specific violence. So you can legally, overturning dimensions of the Smith Act of 1940, legally say we need an overthrow of the government, but you cannot say you need to overthrow that government, which if it results in, say, an insurrection and individuals then attempt to overthrow the government, then you can be held accountable. But otherwise, if you do not incite Joe to insurrect the specific United States government, then you are legally valid in your claims. You can call for sentiments, but you cannot call for actions. So we see this development of free speech in the United States in which we see restrictions and protections of it. So at the current standard, we see the implementation and protection of New York Times v. Sullivan and Brandenburg v. Ohio, as we can call for general sentiments but cannot directly call for immediate violence, nor can we publish or speak of libel and slander in our public publications knowingly. So let's start our progression through history in the United States. First off, I want to start by acknowledging the abolitionist movement. This is where we had numerous leaders: John Brown, Nat Turner, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, all advocating for the freedom of the formerly enslaved individuals within the southeastern states of the United States. So I'll briefly go through all of these individuals and then cap by a brief acknowledgement of the 1863 New York draft riots and massacre, which happened in the city of New York and acts as one of the largest mass insurrections in U.S. history outside of the Civil War. So first off, who is John Brown? John Brown is a white male abolitionist from the northern region of the United States. He was extremely religious, believed his actions would spark a mass slave rebellion. Now, he did lead one dimension of a mass rebellion, but failed as he believed God would send the notice to the mass collection of slaves to lead their rebellion. And we do see the reality that there was no system for notifying the slaves of the South when the rebellion occurred, and the rebellion was concentrated at Harper's Ferry in the northern region of the southern states. Now, John Brown did lead this rebellion and eventually led during this rebellion insurrection in which they claimed the grounds of Harper's Ferry for numerous days and eventually lost their life during this fight. But it did reveal a sentiment that there were many white abolitionists of the North advocating for the freedom of slaves of the South. We also see Nat Turner, an individual who sparked a new wave of oppressive legislation, sadly, through their progressive acts, in which they led the most substantial slave rebellion in U.S. history. Now, there is a reality that after this had occurred, we see a significant wave of oppressive legislation prohibiting education, movement, and assembly of enslaved people of the South, and really brought a period in which we revealed the horrors of slavery like no other time in U.S. history, also encouraging the intense and negative reactions of the slave owners of the South regarding the treatment of their individuals. And this revealed great horrors and catastrophes of the practice itself. And although Nat Turner did die in his rebellion, which resulted in 200 individuals, other enslaved individuals being murdered, he did lead what was almost one of the most successful and substantial slave rebellions of the South, providing great fear in the plantation owners of those southern states. This rebellion significantly stifled pro-slavery, anti-abolitionist convictions that persisted in that region until the American Civil War. So we also see one of the greatest writers in U.S. history, Frederick Douglass, also one of the greatest oratory leaders of the United States, as he gave at the time one of the most notable speeches on the White House lawn, in which he states, "What to the slave is the 4th of July? This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, but I must mourn." End quote, revealing the sentiments that many Southern African Americans maintained, that although we see victory and joyous celebration on the 4th of July, this 4th of July, this national holiday, means but oppression and misery for many, many individuals who call this nation their home in some form or another. We also see later developments of Sojourner Truth leading a sentiment that the intersectionality of two movements can bring progress, not delay. Sojourner Truth, an African-American woman advocating for women's suffrage, the right for women to vote, which would not be obtained until the 1920s, but also simultaneously advocating for racial equality, put at the fringe of two movements and restricted from being able to adequately represent the sentiment she portrayed. In this moment in U.S. history, we see her trying to stand in a women's suffrage march, and in a certain moment at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in 1851, she was asked to not participate. And when she was asked to not participate, she stood strong and sternly, stating, famously, "Aren't I a woman?" demanding that she would be able to advocate for the intersection of both women's rights and racial equality in the United States, to the dissatisfaction of many of the white females in that movement at the time, believing that connecting racial equality and the fight for racial equality to women's suffrage would only delay both movements. Now, I also want to acknowledge the 1863 New York City draft riots and massacre. This was a period of mass violence by a white mob against a black community in New York City. At the riot, we see Union troops return from the Battle of Gettysburg and were eventually able to stifle these riots. Some historians argue that up to 400 people were killed that day, but we do know that the absolute minimum lives lost was 120, and it consisted of an entire week of mass violence in the streets of New York City. So this is the largest mass insurrection in U.S. history besides the Civil War, as thousands of individuals were in the streets participating in violent insurrections, many of whom hiding in their homes, barricading themselves away for a week's time, trying to obtain safety and security. And we see, if you are interested, there are additional resources on this period in history, as well as other massacres in predominantly the abolitionist period, but also we see expanding beyond this period, in which we see cities become periods of rife conflict, violent and bloody battles in the streets of American cities. This resource is the ZIND Project, ZINNED project.org, and this is where you see a breakdown of many of the worst moments in U.S. history. Now, expanding beyond the abolitionist movement, because we remember the abolition movement was successful. We, through the Civil War, eventually found a period of Reconstruction era legislation in which we were rebuilding the nation and rebuilding it to include a collective previously oppressed and rejected, the black formerly enslaved individuals of the southeastern states of the United States. So this is the Reconstruction era. We have ended the Civil War. We are at the end of a period of domestic conflict. We have goals of this period, which are to reunify and rebuild the southern states. These southern states, including my home city of Richmond, Virginia, were oftentimes burnt to ashes, and the individuals among these collectives were brought to poverty as the resources were absolutely bled dry, and cities were torn down in result of mass conflict and a civil war. So we want to rebuild the South and reunify the South. This is where we see presidential pardons, including all previous Civil War, all previous Confederate soldiers, and a sense to show that we are unifying, not punishing those of the lost cause in the South. We also see we have a goal, an additional goal, addressing the status of the formerly enslaved population. Not only are there individuals that were immensely oppressed that are trying to create individual sovereignty in this new nation, they are doing this in communities that have absolutely been abolished during this conflict, that are themselves, those former oppressors are now themselves dealing with mass poverty. So there is mass poverty in the South, both for the former enslavers and the formerly enslaved, one collective with far less reasoning as to why it has occurred to them. We see, that would be the formerly enslaved, far less individual reasoning. So we see another sad period in U.S. history in the Reconstruction era, as we have implemented Reconstruction era amendments 13, 14 to 15, expanding voting rights and citizenship, but with all movements come a counter movement. And the counter movement of the Reconstruction era progress comes in the form of black codes. This is legislation passed in southern states to restrict the rights of previously enslaved individuals, but they go beyond the Jim Crow era legislation that we are familiar with. A lot of these black codes required yearly labor contracts, and if you did not have a yearly labor contract, you were facing arrest. If you did not have direct employment, you were viewed as an illegal individual in the United States. We see also restricted work outside of plantations for white Americans unless a tax was paid. Restricted all work outside of plantations for non-white Americans. Apologies, I will fix that typo in the slide. Unless a tax was directly paid. We also see this allowed for any white citizen to arrest any African American for simple suspicion of a crime. And we see additionally the banned ownership of guns for those of black heritage in the South. We also see the action of sharecropping dominating in this region. Landowners allowed a tenant to use the land in return for a share of the crops produced on that land, what would look like at the time, beyond poverty rates of payment. Oftentimes, when what you would think today as minimum wage of $7 or whatever it is in some states being poverty, think of this as pennies on every dollar. So sharecropping dominated the southern states, using restrictions that required African Americans to work on plantations, and that made it to where this was inadequate work for those individuals. They were basically in the same conditions they were prior to the Civil War, with minimal payouts and protections under federal law, but loosely, and I emphasize extremely loosely, enforced. We also see the executive office of the federal government was aiming to restrict the ability of certain Reconstruction era legislation. Andrew Johnson, this resulted in the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Now we see he was impeached for his role in preventing Reconstruction era legislation, in addition to some private misconduct that was identified among him and other representatives in office. We see that the president had one acquittal, not because of majority acquittal in the Senate, as he was tried for the second step of the impeachment process, removal from office in the Senate. A little bit of review there. But this was not because a majority of senators supported his policies, but simply because a sufficient minority wished to protect the office of the president and preserve the constitutional balance of powers, emphasizing that the action of removal from office must be one that is clearly supported by nearly all representatives, revealing a precedent that will be maintained throughout all of U.S. history until contemporary days. We see Andrew Johnson was noted as vetoing legislation Congress overwhelmingly passed to protect the rights of those who had been freed from slavery, And later, and we know he was impeached for numerous additional reasons, primarily revolving around conduct as he fired and replaced the Secretary of War at the time, which, as we know, developed to be the Secretary of Defense, and in recent months has become renamed as the Secretary of War. So, position that you may, growing up, have referred to as Secretary of Defense, now Secretary of War once again. We see Andrew Johnson's inability to be adequate in conduct when he was firing, hiring, and replacing the individual who was the head of that department. So I previously mentioned some Reconstruction era amendments. So let's go through them one by one because it is essential to understand these three amendments and their impact on U.S. history and the need for later legislation to support them. So first, how do we respond to a region of our nation formerly enslaving a dominating, a notable percentage of the population? Well, first, we just have to think about it rationally. You have to first abolish the institution that restricted their ability to be citizens, ability to be freed persons, abolish slavery and involuntary servitude at large. Second, what must you do? You must say that these previously enslaved people and those who fell victim of involuntary servitude are now free persons and citizens of the United States. Grant them full citizenship in the United States, among other actions which we will explore momentarily. And additionally, finally, once you have ended slavery and granted citizenship, you must then grant the right to vote to those who were previously restricted due to their race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. All males above the age of 21 now have the right to vote due to our 15th Amendment. Now, let's backtrack and talk about the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, is the immediate aftermath of the Civil War and was ratified alongside those Reconstruction era amendments, the 13th and 15th. In this, we see due process clause, which alone has resulted in protections of fundamental rights, acts as the foundation for selective incorporation, as we previously mentioned, expands access to fair treatment under the law, significantly limits government power, and so much more. We see within our Constitution, Section 1, within the 14th Amendment of our Constitution, Section 1 directly addresses state action, the privileges and immunities of leadership, citizenship processes in the United States. How if you were born in the United States, you are immediately granted your right to citizenship, the process of due process, and equal protection in the United States, that all individuals are provided due process and the equal protection under the law of the United States. Secondly, we see Section 2 addresses the apportionment of representatives to Congress, a significantly overlooked aspect of the 14th Amendment, directly addressing how we will apportion our representatives to Congress. This dimension of our amendment states directly, representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. But when the right to vote to any election for the choice of electors for President and Vice President of the United States, representatives in Congress, the executive and judicial offices of a state, or the members of the legislative thereof, is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such state being 21 years of age and a citizen of the United States, or in any way abridged except for participation in rebellion or other crimes, the basis of representation therein shall be reduced in the proportion which the number of such male citizens shall bear to the whole number of male citizens 21 years of age in such state, determining that the apportionment of a state will be determined based on the number of all males of the age of 21, and clearly overriding the 3/5 compromise that is established in our Constitution, illustrating how you need a constitutional amendment to override dimensions of the Constitution, and it does not have to be the overarching intention of the amendment as long as it is a section of it. Section 2, overturning that dimension of that shameful, I guess you could say, not so great compromise, the 3/5 compromise. Section 3 forbids anyone who participates in insurrection or rebellion against the United States from holding federal office. This has been referred to in some court case hearings in recent years, but we do see if you participate in insurrection, predominantly as a part of the Confederate Army in the southeastern states, that is the intention behind this section of the 14th Amendment, You were then restricted from holding public office. We see those past Confederate soldiers and leadership individuals not being able to run for election in the new reunited Union of the United States of Government. This has been relied upon in numerous interpretations provided by our Supreme Court. Guest lecturer. Hello, there's Mel. Goodbye. Section 4 addresses federal debt and repudiates debts accrued by the Confederacy. Debts will be taken on by the national government. Section 5 expressly authorizes Congress to enforce the 14th Amendment by appropriate legislation. So we see this is the responsibility and duty of our legislature to enforce the 14th Amendment and create any required legislation to make the 14th Amendment enforceable as long as constitutionally legitimate. So this is where we see the restrictions of that 15th Amendment, which resulted in two key acts of legislation in the 1960s. And this is where we enter what is known as the Jim Crow era of legislation. So there are four predominant tools used to restrict minorities from reaching the polls during this era, from roughly the 1930s to the 60s, 70s. So these tools included white primaries. Why were white primaries able to occur? For one, remembering from past lectures, who is in charge of running the primary process among political parties? It is the party themselves, opening the door for a lack of federal regulation in the electoral process, predominantly in the primary process, which enabled some southern states to implement what are referred to as white primaries. This is where only white citizens could vote in primary elections. The most clear version of restricting minority access to polls via white primaries, requiring certain race qualifications to be met to contribute to the primary process, although our general electoral process was protected in this current system. So white primaries, preventing minorities from influencing the polls due to restricting them from making a decision about who will represent the two dominating political parties. We also see the grandfather clause. This is one that I kind of chuckle at in certain moments because it restricted voting to those who could prove they had an ancestor that voted prior to 1867, prior to the Reconstruction era. So we would all have to prove that we had, through documentation that would be obtained during or prior to the Civil War, that we had direct lineage to individuals who were able to vote then. Basically stating, if you are not a direct family member, which would mean that you have a high tendency to align with the race of those individuals, then you could not vote. And guess what? Everybody who voted prior to 1867 was a white male above the age of 21, which makes it to where that restriction was clearly interpreted. And beyond the restriction being race-oriented, it is logistically difficult. And in contemporary days, I don't know if we'd have but 20 people voting in our presidential elections. That's an extreme exaggeration. Many people have lineage that goes far back, but I know I would not have the right to vote in this electoral system. We also see an electoral system that implements grandfather clause. We also see poll taxes. This was as simple as you can imagine and required later legislation directly to abolish it. Poll taxes required a payment of a fee to vote, oftentimes only asking African American individuals in the South to provide their poll taxes. In addition, understanding the economic restrictions that those were people who were not able to work for a good living, and all the resources they were able to obtain through their labor had to go to their cost of living directly. So they did not have expendable income to necessarily provide to a poll tax. Additionally, we remember in response to Nat Turner's almost successful rebellion that resulted in him losing his life, and other rebellions led by those individuals of the North, we see literacy tests were not only were literacy tests implemented, there were high levels of restriction of individuals being able to learn how to read and write and interpret text. And of course, this would be a tool utilized in later decades to restrict these individuals from voting, as they required literacy tests, as people had to read and recite oftentimes highly complicated texts that were, again, only tasked to African American individuals. And there are some studies that have indicated that many white Southern voters would not have been able to pass these literacy tests that were not brought forward to them. So we see beyond these four policy initiatives, legislative acts utilized to restrict minorities from reaching the polls, there were social barriers, which include violence of peers and social pressures, oftentimes saying you may not be able to work in this career or be the reverend of the church if you continue these sentiments of freedom. So these social barriers were extensive through legislation and general sentiments among the general public. So that's where we enter a period of enforced segregation in the United States that would soon be dismantled through a Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Education. But before this ruling, it was legally founded with constitutional validity via a Supreme Court ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson, which we acknowledged and examined earlier on in this course. So Jim Crow legislation enforced segregation through the four means I previously emphasized prior, in addition to clear laws requiring black and white public good entities. So during this period of high levels of segregation and oppression of those in the southeastern states, we see a 70-year period of protected segregation under the constitutional legitimacy of Plessy v. Ferguson, and that eventually resulted in the banning in Brown v. Board of Education, and resulted in it being banned for only 61 years since its abolition in this Brown v. Board of Education ruling. But that also brings us to a point where we have to understand two very important terms in this course. That is de jure segregation and de facto segregation. Let's begin with de jure segregation, because this is the segregation that existed in the United States prior to certain legislative acts in the 1960s. So de jure segregation, I like using this little tagline, de jure judicial, it's official, judicial, the laws. If you have de jure segregation, you have a segregation that is enforced through laws. Jure, judicial, officially enforced with laws via the judicial branch. A little way to remember it, don't write those words on a piece of paper though. De jure segregation is segregation established through laws being enforced in whatever nation they exist. Now, it is worth noting that de jure segregation does not exclusively pertain to those segregated based on race, but also those segregated based off gender, policy positions, ideological affiliation, or any other general way of identifying. So de jure segregation is segregating people along established lines, whether that is race or gender or whatever it is, and enforcing this segregation through laws. We see in some sense men and women have been separated by law in prisons and public restrooms, as well as in law enforcement and military settings, in sense with de jure segregation. In the United States military, for example, women were until recently blocked by law, de jure segregation, from serving in combat roles, and men and women are still typically housed separately, oftentimes through rules within our military conduct books that result in de jure segregation enforced through rules and laws within a system. Now, how does this differ? Well, of course, also before we move on, I want to note that this was what was present in the United States prior to 1964. Now, what is the opposite of de jure judicial segregation? De facto segregation, and I do not have a flowing way of remembering this. It's the opposite of de jure. De facto segregation is segregation as a result of social practices, and this is when the law does not enforce any segregation legislation. This is oftentimes a result of years of de jure segregation, and once it is dismantled, you do not see collectives immediately desegregated. A great example that separates us from any personal history is the example of South Africa post-apartheid. Even today, apartheid ended in the state, which was de jure segregation in South Africa. It ended in the early 1990s. After this abolition of de jure segregation, there is and still is a period of de facto segregation, where you look at one neighborhood and it is roughly 96% white, while the neighborhood on the other side of a single dividing street is 96% African American, well, black, and not African American because they are not Americans. They would be South African. We see that these individuals, this form of de facto segregation, does not have laws enforcing it, but instead relies on social practices, maintenance of economic influences, and tradition that result in dividing lines among a specific metric, either race, gender, or whatever it may be. Under the case of the United States and post-apartheid South Africa, we see this is along the lines of race. Many parts of the United States, due to economic influences, are still experiencing levels of de facto segregation, with some neighborhoods being predominantly African American and large percentages, with others being predominantly white at large percentages, due to long-lasting economic influences, as we can simply understand through the lens of if our parents had a certain degree of economic freedom, there is that level of restriction in the access we have to resources in our youth that would enable us to meet greater levels of economic freedom. Of course, we do not have hard caps. That is why it is not de jure. There are no rules and laws restricting individuals, but there are social standards, economic histories, and practices that has resulted in these inequalities. That would be de facto segregation. This will always follow the dismantling of de jure segregation, and political scientists argue that this is almost always an extended and long period of progressing access to class mobility within a single society from a collective that was previously restricted due to legislation. Now, let's talk about the legislation that ended de jure segregation and opened the door for a gradual dismantling of what we understand as de facto segregation. So, what did the Civil Rights Act of 1964 do? This was passed after a period of struggle in which we had civil rights legislation brought forward, but ended through filibusters. None more notable than the 1958, I believe, filibuster led by Strom Thurmond on the Civil Rights Act of 1958, which mirrored a lot of the legislation provided in this act, but was halted due to Strom Thurmond's filibuster of 24 hours and 18 minutes. So we see the Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination on the basis of race, gender, color, religion, or national origins. Finally, we have legislation connecting the fight for women's suffrage and the fight for racial equality. Sojourner Truth got her wishes in 1964. Ban discrimination at the polls, public accommodations like hotels, restaurants, and most importantly, schools, as we remember that period in U.S. history of George Wallace standing in front of the public institution, restricting the young African American girl's ability to access a fair and equal education, requiring the National Guard to demand that he step aside. And of course, history reminds us that George Wallace lost that fight out in front of that school. So, we see the Civil Rights Act not only stated that discrimination is over, but enabled the federal government to sue schools and institutions that refuse to desegregate. Not only are we saying that the federal National Guards and federal militaries can come in and ensure that we are desegregating, but we will provide economic incentives for you to do so too, through suing through our federal legal system, which oftentimes results in either forced actions like the desegregation of the school or economic punishments that are so restrictive that they require the school to only act in one accordance. So we see this established the right to equality of opportunity in the workplace. No longer can you discriminate based off of a loose interpretation of gender, race, color, or whatever it may be in the workplace, including religion or political affiliation. We see these protections under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We also know the Voting Rights Act of 1965, an essential additional piece of legislation in which our legislative branch had to act in accordance with the judicial branch to enforce the ruling provided a decade and 1 year plus prior in Brown v. Board of Education. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibited discriminatory voting practices such as literacy tests and established federal oversight in areas with high levels of voter suppression. So violence in the streets was no longer accepted, and instead we will have police restricting those from using that tool of oppression. We will no longer have literacy tests. There will no longer be poll taxes. These restrictive practices will no longer sit in any state in the United States. And we see this legislation was productive and it was effective. It provided a state like Mississippi, which In the election of 1954, only had 5% of the eligible African American voters, not 5% of all African American voters, 5% of those males of the age of 21 plus voting in the presidential election. Now, fast forward to just one electoral cycle after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, not even a whole 4 years, but 3 years later in 1968, roughly 60% of the eligible African American voting population cast their ballot, revealing 55% of a population, the majority of a population, being previously restricted due to the discriminatory voting practices such as literacy tests, poll taxes, and general social pressures preventing them from reaching the polls. Our legislative branch responded to the needs of our judicial branch after the implementation of the Brown v. Board of Education ruling and drafted two essential pieces of legislation, providing the federal government the ability to ensure the desegregation of southern states and abolishing the restrictions and the tools utilized by those southern states in these two acts. So let's take a step back and acknowledge these threats through a more contemporary lens. Before we even dive into contemporary understandings, we know that the black codes of these southeastern states in the Reconstruction era of the United States heavily brought one collective, one racial identity into the prison industrial system in the United States, replacing what many have wrote in public publications at the time, replacing the institution of slavery with the institution of the prison. Now, of course, this development has been dismantled exponentially, and this correlation between previously racially oppressed individuals and the oppression within our prison industrial complex has diminished. But we do see that in contemporary days, the United States has the most citizens incarcerated globally out of all nations with accessible data. It's an important caveat, but many nations do provide accessible data. And it is also worth noting, we do not have the highest incarceration rate per 100,000 individuals. We have the sixth highest incarceration rate per 100,000 individuals. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you take 100,000 individuals at random in the United States, you have a chance of having 531 of them currently residing in a prison. Now, that is different from states like El Salvador, which has the highest rate of incarceration globally at 1,086 per 100,000 individuals. But we do see for Western democracies, we are at the top of the list. We see that the United States has 5% of the total global population and 25% of the world's prison population. The prison and jail population has peaked many years in our past, not many years. Well, to some of you in this class, this might be many years. It's right around when you were born. We see in the year 2008, 2.3 million individuals were incarcerated in the United States. In the year 2019, that rate has decreased to 2.1 million. We have seen a steady decline ever since the year of 2008 in our incarceration rates, as this became a point of general contention among the general population, as we've seen legislation around felony disenfranchisement becoming a focal point in the United States. That will be something we will acknowledge in a later discussion, but you can see the connection here, as I won't even waste time going to that. We see that we are number one out of all nations for which data is available regarding the number of citizens incarcerated, but not the rate of incarceration per citizen. We see that the United States spends about $8 billion each year housing our roughly 2 million inmates, and 32% of the U.S. population consists of African American or Hispanic citizens, although 52% of the incarcerated population comes from this community, revealing a racial disparity that persists today. That is a point of discussion and analysis for many researchers, even today. Now, we also know and acknowledge that I like to have a brief acknowledgement because we live in a period of high levels of partisanship. And this issue is not one of partisan origins. We see the realignment of political parties in the 60s and 70s push many pro-segregationists out of one political party into the other. But beyond this sentiment, we see that the actions of both Democratic and Republican candidates after this party realignment has resulted in the increasing rate of incarceration among citizens and increasing rate of incarceration among racial minorities in the United States via Ronald Reagan's administration's war on drugs in the 1980s, and additionally expanded under Bill Clinton's administration, enacting some of the most detrimental prison reform laws like mandatory sentencing and three-strike laws, which were bipartisan in nature at the time, supported by both Democrats and Republicans. The responsibility and accountability resides on the American system and people, not either of the American political parties or any American political candidate. So we know the modern prison industrial complex, well stocked, but decreasing in the rates of incarceration with each year and decade since 2008. We also have to understand one of the most recent developments in the fight for equality, civil rights, and civil liberty protections within the United States. This was a ruling that we've covered in this class, provided in 2015, in which a man by the last name of Obergefell was fighting for his deceased husband to be labeled on his death certificate as married, also providing some of those resources that a previously married widow is able to provide. So able to obtain. Apologies for that sentence. So this landmark decision of the Supreme Court ruled that the fundamental right to marriage is guaranteed to all couples regardless of same-sex affiliation. And the ruling of this Supreme Court landmark, the interpretation of this Supreme Court landmark ruling relies on the 14th Amendment, particularly the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause of that amendment. And we see that this is not a unanimous decision, as it was ruled a 5-4 decision in support of Obergefell, and ruled that the marriage of Obergefell and his deceased husband must be legally counted by the federal government. Now, one more final brief discussion about something we talked about earlier on in this lecture, but I want to tie it to one of the first lectures in this course. That is selective incorporation. We remember selective incorporation is the case-by-case basis in which we say that restrictions of the federal government via our Bill of Rights also applies to state governments. But to understand that, we have to know why it originally only applied to the federal government and not to state governments. Well, let's rewind a bit and remember that divide between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists as we debated the merits of our Constitution. We will remember that the Federalists had this overarching fear that the last thing we want is a overwhelming federal government. We also see they have a prioritization of local government, state sovereignty, not as much individual sovereignty as much as it is a focus on state sovereignty. If it was focused on individual sovereignty, those southern states would be immediately contradicting their constitutional protection at the time of being able to own slaves. So we see they, instead of a focus on individual rights as much, it is a focus on state rights and state sovereignty. The Bill of Rights was established to appease the fears of the Anti-Federalists. And what were the fears? The fear was that the federal government would overwhelm state governments that have many individuals working within them. Now, the Bill of Rights was a direct restriction on that federal government in those 10 ways. Remember that 10th Amendment summarizes this perfectly. If we have not directly restricted the federal government in a specific sense, we are allowing these rights to be granted to the states, not as much to the individuals, but to the states and then the people. So we see a progression: federal government, states, and then the people. So the Anti-Federalists wanted to protect the states. So we implemented the Bill of Rights, which restricted the federal government from impeding on the rights and authority and sovereignty of those state entities. Now, we have to fast forward about 100 years. It's the 1830s, and we have a Supreme Court case in which somebody stated that you cannot restrict this on the state government because this Bill of Rights applies to our federal government and does not have jurisdiction on the state level. Our Supreme Court at the time ruled in favor of that sentiment. The Bill of Rights restricts the federal government, not state government. So the individual was cleared of this circumstance. So we needed a period of selective incorporation, which relied on the 14th Amendment, which generally states that all protections will be provided to all citizens within the United States. Well, that equal protection clause made it to where you cannot overpower the rights of individuals by a state government. Our Constitution directly states this. That is how our Supreme Court interpreted it. And then we had to go through a period of case-by-case analyses by our Supreme Court in which we stated the 14th Amendment means that the federal government nor the state government can restrict that individual liberty. So we see the connection between selective incorporation, anti-federalist, and civil liberties is that selective incorporation was required to expand the scope in which our civil liberties are protected, not just from a federal government, but also from a state government and all government entities for that sake. This is a quick slide in which I will just ask you to go on Eagle Online and check out that optional video. You don't have to, but as you watch the video, I just want to ask you to maintain these general goals in bullet points at the bottom of the slide. This video is a presentation on what civil liberties are, but from a Canadian political scientist. So we see that nuance in how our neighbors up north differ, but also don't differ on any true level when it comes to interpreting concepts like civil liberties. What do we learn? Go back, rewind, make sure you understand what I rambled on about when I talked about de jure, de facto segregation, the impacts of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of both 1964 and 65. Understand the 4 primary tools utilized to prevent minorities from reaching the polls. Understand the unique dimensions of the 13th, 14th, 15th amendments in a 1-sentence summary, in addition to being able to explore the 14th Amendment in detail. We also want to make sure that we understand the rates of incarceration among nations throughout the globe, that we do not have the highest incarceration rate, although we have the highest number of citizens incarcerated. We have to define selective incorporation and understand its connection with the anti-federalists and the concept of civil liberties, and beyond all things, make sure you understand the difference between a civil liberty and a civil right. Here are the answers to all the things I just told you should know. What do we got to do this week? So at the end of this week, please wait till the end of this week after you've contributed to your discussions thoroughly and completed all the required readings and listened to me ramble on into this lecture. Make sure that you complete your quiz. The quiz covers everything in section 3 of the course. Think about every lecture that we covered after the 3 branches of government. This is where we are focusing generally on the general structures around us. Political parties, election campaigns, and civil liberties and civil rights are all covered in this quiz. I will prioritize the focus on civil rights and civil liberties, focusing additionally on the main takeaways from the campaigns and elections slide, in which we covered the 3 electoral processes: first past the post, winner takes all, and ranked choice voting, in addition to some of the foundational aspects of the political parties lecture, predominantly regarding what a united and divided government is, among other concepts present in the What Did We Learn slides from that lecture. Thank you, guys. I was a bit quick last week as I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a break. We're hitting that 1-hour mark on almost every lecture, as we did again today, and likely to do again in the future. We might have one lecture that falls under it, but I did want to give you that 1 week to just breathe, make sure we're caught up, get those midterms in, not get overwhelmed with content, just figure out where we are in the course. And then this week, where I throw it all back at you and we learn about civil rights and civil liberties. And thank you guys for sticking with me. Good job, even though I didn't see any of you or have any ability to get feedback. But it was great talking to my screen, and I hope I get to have some more discussions and email you later on. Thank you, guys.